Kelly, it's a pleasure to be here at the Napa Valley Wine Center.
Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. I'm very much looking forward to this class, Understanding Napa Valley. Could you tell us a little bit about it to start out?
Sure. So this is our most popular class. And the idea of this class was to not replace a day of wine tasting in the valley, which is still the best way to get to know Napa Valley or any wine region, but to create a lot of context so that it can enhance your experience touring around the valley and tasting a variety of wines. Because when you go to a winery, I mean, chances are you're getting their story. You're learning about that place and that family. But it relates, every part of Napa is pretty small.
Yeah.
So everything is really quite interrelated. And so this is basically the rug that ties the room together, right? And ideally, concierge and I are totally in sync, which we often are. We'll catch somebody at the beginning of their trips. They take this class before they go out and visit wineries. And then they have a better sense of, okay, I understand basics of Napa's climate. So I understand why this is unique or typical, right? I have a basic understanding of Napa's history. So I can see how this fits into the overall story arc of Napa Valley, or, you have a basic understanding of Napa's soil geology and things like that. So this is very much an overview. We usually teach it with 5 glasses of wine, and each glass is basically just its own story. So these are 5 stories of Napa Valley, different eras in history. We use Chardonnay to talk about the climate. We use Zinfandel to talk about Prohibition. Drink a
Oh,
couple of Cabernets. So it all kind of relates back to the wine glass too.
love that.
Thanks.
Well, I'm looking forward to learning about the timeline.
Yeah.
It's very fascinating. So,
Wine education has been an important part of Meadowood since 1985. So I was really honored to take up that mantle. I've been here for 6 years now, and we're just refining things and trying new things and adding more classes and seeing what works. And so far, we feel very, very happy.
yes.
Yeah.
So when people come to the wine center, I'm sure you have very early beginners to very seasoned wine enthusiasts. So what's your approach depending on the audience for the class?
That's a great question. When a guest books at Meadowood, they receive a PDF or a printout that's basically a menu of wine classes they can take. And some of them are very intro level, and some of them are really quite advanced. But that almost doesn't matter because since all of our classes are private, even if, say, a beginner accidentally signs up for a geekier class, we start each class with a conversation with the person, so we have a better understanding of where they're coming from, what they're hoping to get out of the class, the knowledge they're bringing to the table, and we can just either dial it down or raise it up depending on where they're at.
Mm.
And we've even had, and oftentimes, the truth of the matter is, even if you're just teaching a couple, right, they're coming with different levels of wine knowledge and interest.
Mhm.
So I run a small team, and I would say the skill that's more important than even wine knowledge for my team is the ability to speak to people at all levels at the same time. So nobody feels like you're talking at them
Mhm.
and nobody feels like you're talking down to them,
Yeah.
right? So it's a real, I would say, a soft skill we take very seriously.
So for this Understanding Napa Valley class, we have 5 wines in front of us. So what was your thought process when selecting these wines today?
Sure. So the wine selections change all the time. We try to, really rotate through some of the best of what Napa has to offer. We want to be able to offer things here that is maybe hard to find elsewhere. So it's not always the rarest of the rare, but insider wineries people may not have heard of, wineries that may not be open to the public,
Mhm.
wineries that may not be broadly distributed, things like that, new projects, etc. And so with this class, I have specific themes that I'm hoping to touch upon with each of these wines, but those themes are big enough that we can alternate through some different options. So I like to start this class with a Napa Valley Riesling, which is your glass on your left,
Yes.
which is kind of an odd wine to start with because there's very little of it made now, but it used to be Napa's flagship white wine in the 1800s. So that's a way of telling a story about Napa's origins. I use Chardonnay, again, that changes all the time, to talk about Napa's climate because as Napa has collectively understood its climate, microclimates, and terroir more and more over the years. What's planted where has changed. And Chardonnay in particular has really undergone a dramatic evolution in where it's planted. So this is kind of the way we talk about that. And Chardonnay also used to be the most widely planted grape in Napa in the 80s. So it's still a really significant part of the story here. Like I said, we use Zinfandel or sometimes Petit Syrah to tell the story of Prohibition, which had a really surprisingly formative effect on the valley today, even though it was a long time ago, almost 100 years. Then for the end, I like to show a pair of Cabernets. And ideally, these two Cabernets are different enough that it gives the attendee a sense of the full stylistic range of Napa Valley Cabernet, right? Because we make Napa has some incredibly complex geology, a huge range of microclimate, a big swing in elevations, all these different variables, not to mention different goals and kind of visions of the people making the wine themselves. So the range of expressions is vast. And I like to choose two wines that are different enough that it kind of maybe unlocks that possibility in case they had a more narrow view of what Napa Cabernet might taste like.
I'm very much looking forward to this tasting.
Good. Me too. Should we get started?
Yeah.
So, like I said, this is our Understanding Napa Valley class, our most popular class. This is just a way to familiarize the guests of Meadowood with Napa Valley as a whole. Some of the points that I like to make, these top 3 points I think are pretty self-evident, right? It's one of the most famous and important wine regions in the world, certainly, but definitely outside of Europe and what we call the New World. It makes wonderful Cabernet Sauvignon, undoubtedly. It's a culinary mecca, so there's really a surprising amount of density of high operating establishments in terms of restaurants, hotels, etc. So it's a very high commitment to food as well as wine, which is great because it's Northern California and a lot of wonderful stuff grows here, right? That's important, I think, to understand about this place too. But it's also, a model of scarcity. And I like to really talk about this point a lot, even though it might sound a little dry, is because many people that come to Napa, their experiences, they land at SFO or Oakland, and then they drive north. And, driving through Napa, it feels like a lot of vines, right? You're just surrounded by vines. And if you're coming up valley, it feels like a lot of vines. But if you take a broader perspective, Napa only produces 4% of the state of California's wines. So it's a really small amount of wine. And then if you back that out even further, that's less than a half of a percent of all of the wine made in the world in a given year comes from Napa. So this is a really tiny place. I think it's about 1/8 the size of Bordeaux, which is kind of the region we compare ourselves to most often. And it's just a different order of magnitude. So it's a tiny, intimate place. And that's important to the character of this place, right? And then the last bit I like to talk about that's interesting is that Cabernet Sauvignon has only been the statistically dominant grape here since 1992. And I think that's surprising to a lot of people because even though, really since the 1940s, the best wines I've had from Napa have been Cabernet Sauvignon, that wasn't always understood to be the direction that everybody should be marching in. So there were these huge periods of experimentation that kind of led to Cabernet Sauvignon. And then for a variety of reasons that we'll get to in a minute, in 1992, kind of collectively, Napa Valley seemed to say, okay, Cabernet is our flagship grape, and that's going to be the sort of focus of this place. And never look back. And that's still the story today. Let's try the first wine. So all the way on your left, this is a Napa Valley Riesling from a producer called Smith Madrone. It's got a little bit of age on it to showcase that kind of yummy petrol note that Riesling can get. And it's just a divine wine. It's a dry style, so it's not sweet. Very vibrant acidity, really crispy, mouth-watering, small, artisan, old school. This is a really off the beaten path winery to discover, but the wines are phenomenal, I think. I like to show this Riesling because of what we already talked about, right? Now it's almost extinct here, but this was once the most important white grape of Napa Valley. So to just go back to the very beginning, right? The foundational history of wine in California starts with the Spanish, right? The Spanish Empire expanded, first to South America, Central America, Mexico, and then it started to move the frontier more and more north, right? And they would move the frontier so far north, they would stop, they would build a mission. That mission would have a vineyard, and that vineyard would produce wine for sacramental purposes only. This was by design, right? So King Philip back in Spain had promised his wineries that he was not going to allow the development of a commercial wine business in the Spanish colonies. So this is in contrast to like the Dutch and the English and the French, who were actively trying to build wine regions in other places like South Africa and other places, right? So here it was the sole dominion of the clergy, at least for a while. Mexico gained its independence in 1821, at which point this land became legally part of Mexico. And that's really when the story of wine here begins. So one of the things that the Mexican government did at that time was they secularized the missions. So they said, let's go, let's show King Philip that we can compete with the Spanish wineries. And so they encouraged the development of commercial wine regions. And so in 1861, eventually we got our first winery, which is Charles Krug, which is still around today, still in family hands, different family, but nonetheless, that's how far back this goes, right? Probably the first vineyard went in the ground between 1838 and 1839, and that still would have been the mission grape that the Spanish had been planting, at these religious centers. But 10 years later, the situation here would change dramatically. So between 1848 and 1850, a couple things happened. You had the Mexican-American War, at the end of which this became a part of the United States, right? And then you also had the gold rush right in the middle of all that. And the gold rush is very important to the development of the wine industries up here and also places like San Francisco, right? Because this was the moment in which the world's eyes kind of turned to Northern California. 'Cause prior to that moment, most of the development, both from a municipal and a commercial standpoint, as well as agricultural, was in the south of California, right around the greater LA area. The gold rush brought people from all over the world to Northern California, but it was a really dangerous journey at that time. This was before the Panama Canal, right? This is before the Transcontinental Railroad. So getting here was hard. It took months often. It was expensive. It was dangerous. And so all these mix of people settled here. Inevitably, only some of them found gold, and what would happen is the other ones would just sort of fall back on their former professions. So this is the way in which Napa gets its first wave of knowledgeable winemakers and grape growers, were people typically European in origin that had come from winemaking families or had come from wine regions. They made it here for whatever reason. They didn't want to go back home. Maybe they spent all their money getting here, and then they looked around and said, we can make this work. We can grow grapes. We can plant wine. And to satisfy that, the kind of beauty was that now they had these two big new markets, right? All the mining communities in the Sierra Nevadas. It turns out that mining is super thirsty work, right? And then they have also this new city in the form of San Francisco. So you had the knowledge and you had the market, and it was just this perfect storm. So our first commercial winery comes in 1861. And then by the time of the 1880s, the wine industry here was booming. So when I moved here from New York City in 2010, I thought the wine industry in Napa started with Robert Mondavi in the 1960s, right? So I was shocked when I got settled here and started researching that the 1880s were so gangbusters. But there was well over 100 wineries here. There's several thousand acres of grapes in the ground. Prohibition would come and knock all that back. But just to give you a sense of things, we wouldn't recover those numbers until the 1980s. So if you imagine Napa in the 1980s, at that point, pretty well established, very famous, we had already achieved that a century prior. And that I think is pretty remarkable. So how this relates to Riesling is that, the story of Napa Valley, like the story of every other part of America, is just waves of immigrants that came and made their mark, right? And so for a variety of reasons, some of which related to political unrest in the region, a lot of Napa's formative winemakers came from Germany, or sort of the greater German area. And at first, nobody had any idea what would grow well here, right?
Yeah.
And so people just planted whatever. And over time, there would be a little editing process like, okay, this year that was great, let's plant more. That was terrible, let's get rid of that. And over time, and it's slow work, right? But over time, certain winners emerged. So by the end of the 1880s, the most popular wineries in Napa, the wines in Napa, were Riesling-based blends called Hocks and Zinfandel-based blends called Clarets, right? They're kind of stealing these European names. So this is honoring that tradition. What do you think of the wine?
Yes, it's very nice. I like get little hints of honeysuckle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Riesling grape, this is coming from a region called the Spring Mountain District, which is where that yellow star is. And it's a winery called Smith Madrone that was established by two brothers in the 1970s. They're still there. They're still making the wine. They make Cabernet, they make Chardonnay, they do all of the sort of normal expected things, but they planted Riesling in the 70s because even at that time, Riesling was one of the most popular and successful grapes here from Napa Valley.
Yeah.
There were years in the 1970s where a ton of Riesling sold for twice what a ton of Cabernet sold for. So this was at the time the sort of commercially sound thing to do. As time goes on, I would say Americans in general have a complex relationship with Riesling. They're freaked out it's going to be sweet, all this sort of stuff. The market has moved away from Napa Valley Riesling, but there are a handful of producers, usually historic producers, that are holding tight to this tradition. And it's a wine style that I love to drink. So I like to show it in the class.
Yes. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
It's very easy to drink this wine.
Yes, it's very easy to drink, and it's nice and refreshing. It kind of occupies the same space on the table that a Sauvignon Blanc might, right? But it's something a little different. So let's move on to the Chardonnay. So I told you, I think in the beginning, that for much of the 80s, Chardonnay was the dominant grape of Napa Valley, right? It's still the second most widely planted grape. But over time, where it's planted has changed, and that has a lot to do with our understanding of Napa's climate. So Napa has a really particular climate. So first of all, on the most macro level, it's classified as a Mediterranean climate, right? Which is obviously named for the Mediterranean. And so what counts as Mediterranean are basically these long, hot, dry summers, and then these short, compressed, wet winters, right? And so Napa has that for sure. And this climate is really famous for being great at ripening specifically grapes and olives, right? And we certainly have a lot of olive trees here as well. So that's the Mediterranean climate. But unlike Italy, these places that are on the actual Mediterranean, we're on the Pacific, which is a much colder body of water, right, than the Mediterranean. So it's a very cold ocean, very big, and therefore the air over it is much colder. And cold air retains moisture better than warm air. So that's part of the reason why the West Coast, especially up here in the north, is so foggy, right? It's so, so foggy. So this fog that comes into Napa every day during the summer is really important to the growing season, okay? It does a number of different things. So first of all, it's more of a summertime phenomenon, which maybe feels a little counterintuitive, right? You would expect to be colder in the winter, right? That feels normal. But here, we have these really brisk mornings in the summer. And what's happening is that the hotter it is in inland California, right? The faster that hot air rises, right? You're familiar with the phrase hot air rising. So it rises faster, the hotter it is, and that sucks the cold air off the ocean with more velocity. So it's pulling that fog further inland when it's hot, if that makes sense. This is the reason why San Francisco is so fogged in the summers, but in the winter you could have, uninterrupted 70-degree robin's blue eggs, shell skies days. So here what happens is because Napa has these tall mountains, right? They're too high for the wind, the ocean breezes and fog coming off the Pacific to just come from the west, right? It kind of comes up against these mountains and then can't pass. But in the south, the valley opens to the San Pablo Bay. So the fog is drawn in every day and fills up the valley from the south and then starts to burn back. So what happens is the areas in the north, like here in St. Helena and Calistoga, are in the fog for way less time than the areas of the south, which are much more fogged in. So this creates this big difference in temperature between the north and south of the valley. And that has over time had a huge impact on where certain varieties have grown, right? Because back in the day, basically you had a property, you're going to plant what you want to drink, right?
Yeah.
Nowadays, there's much more awareness of what should go where, what's best for the site, right? And that's a relatively modern, that conversation didn't really start happening until like the 1940s, right? So the Chardonnay, which is actually, decently temperature sensitive, started to and wants to be colder than, say, Cabernet, started to move south closer to the bay. So places like Carneros, Oak Knoll, things like that, started to move to the west, a little bit closer to the ocean, and then up in elevation. So this Chardonnay is from a producer called Kongsgaard, and they are closed to the public. This is their Carneros Chardonnay. So it's a richer style of Chardonnay, but it's not, overly heavy or aggressively oaked or anything. It's still wonderfully made, but very recognizably Californian in style, I would say. What do you think? Do you drink a lot of Chardonnay?
I do love Chardonnay.
Oh, good.
Has a nice body.
Very creamy. Lots of texture.
We get the oak influence slightly. Nice.
Good. Yeah, John Kongsgaard is widely considered to be one of the better white wine makers in California, and he very famously invented Newton unfiltered Chardonnay. For your listeners that are an older generation, yeah, he's the master of Chardonnay. That's considered to be his grape.
I like that. Mr. Chardonnay.
I saw him speak one time, and he said something that's always stuck with me. He said that California needs more white wine heroes, like people to focus, because we're so occupied with red wine, which is great, but it's wonderful to have somebody really focused in on a white grape as their primary interest.
Yes. Well, cheers to this.
Cheers. So, as successful as Chardonnay was for California and Napa in the 1980s, it gave way in 1992 for a very kind of wonderfully silly reason. So two things happened in the 80s that kind of teed Napa up for this transition over to being Cabernet dominance. So one of them was physical. There was a pest that kind of came to Napa Valley called phylloxera. I'm sure you've heard of it, right? It eats and injures the roots of wine grapes, right? And so that came back in the 1980s, and people were in denial for a long time, but eventually they realized everybody was going to have to replant, right? So there was this more or less, not totally like everybody, but a big portion of vineyards across California had to replant in the late 80s, early 90s, right? So it's this massive kind of shaking of the Etch-a-Sketch, right? An opportunity to, very expensive and I'm sure very incredibly stressful, but also an opportunity to rethink things, try new technologies in the vineyard, maybe new row orientations, new rootstocks, new varieties, and Napa kind of aligned itself to Cabernet at this point. The other thing driving that change is more to do with pop culture, which is pretty fun. So I started in the wine industry in the year 2001, and 3 years later, Sideways came out, right? So yeah, you know this movie, right? So my formative memories of the wine industry were of this massive, just overnight change in people's drinking habits, right? Nobody wanted Merlot, everybody wanted Pinot Noir. And we're still, in some ways, kind of still stuck in that moment, right? So for a previous generation, that moment happened in 1991. And in 1991, 60 Minutes, which at the time was the most widely watched program in America, made a show called The French Paradox. And you can still find clips of it on YouTube. But basically, the question they were hoping to solve that hour was, why does America have so much more heart disease than France when you consider sort of the diets and the lifestyle? And so you see the camera kind of panning through the French supermarket, and it's like cheese, cheese, like meat, meat, cheese, cream, and then everybody smoking, 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 and they're like, how, how is there so little heart disease here? And the conclusion that they more or less came to by the end of the program was it was the antioxidants in red wine.
Oh.
Now, this has all been debunked, not just the heart smart nature of red wine, which I want to believe, but I think is medically untrue, sadly. But I still hold on to it. But even this idea that the French have less heart disease, right? That has also been debunked. But nonetheless, this was such a huge moment in American pop culture because alcohol, and we're still in this moment as well, has always had this kind of bad reputation in the medical community as not really being beneficial. It's really only having negatives and no positives. And if you dig into the scientific research, which I'm sure you have, like there are all these wonderful benefits to moderate consumption of wine, especially with meals. You know, there's certainly some risks, but there's undeniable health benefits, both physical and psychological, right? But this moment, the 60 Minutes program, was the first kind of thumbs up from the medical industry that wine had had in America for a long time. And so overnight, and you can look at the statistics and it's crazy, people stopped drinking white wine and picked up red wine. And so the confluence of these two forces, the, the phylloxera pressure and this seismic moment in American drinking habits kind of aligned to open the door for Chardonnay to step into the back seat and Cabernet to step in the front in Napa. And that really happened around 1992. So any questions on any of that before we move on?
Well, I think that's definitely something to double click on because nowadays people kind of forget about the health benefits of wine, right? Because some people are drinking a little bit less. So,
Yeah, and you know, I always try to make it very clear to people that I am not a doctor and not here to give medical advice. But occasionally I get clients in front of me that want to know more, and I have a whole folder on my desk of articles, you know, kind of interpreting, digging deeper into the data that show the positive the
yeah.
health benefits of wine, and I like to hand those out. So I'm not directly giving medical advice, but I'm pointing them in the
Yeah.
right direction.
Nice.
So yeah. Okay, so that's our man, John
Yeah.
Kongsgaard. And this is another view of the Appalachian map of Napa, and the star there is in the south in Carneros. So what you don't see in this map is that the line to the left is both the county line between Napa and Sonoma and the ridge line of the Mayacamas Mountains. So what you see as what's down there as Los Carneros is actually only half the picture. The Carneros actually extends into Sonoma as well, so it spans the two counties, which is very rare in wine law. Um, and it being closer to the bay and in the south, it's far more cool and windy than other parts of Napa Valley, and it really does great with Chardonnay. All right, are you ready to get back in the time machine?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. This wine here is just a wine I love to show and talk about. I get a lot of consumers that are here specifically for Napa Cabernet. That's what they want to drink. That's what they came here for. And I love it. And I love them. And I'm happy to do that all day. There's not, in my experience, a lot of overlap between Cabernet drinkers and Zinfandel drinkers all the time, which is a shame because, in my opinion, when Zinfandel is done right, it can be such a wonderful wine. And this is one of my favorite producers from Zinfandel. It's called Turley. And this is their old vine Zinfandel. So it's not actually Napa appellation, though it has a lot of Napa fruit in here. It's California appellation because what these guys have done is they have combed the sort of northern half of the state for old vines, Zinfandel, and Petit Syrah vineyards. And then they come in and they work with the owners of the property, which are sometimes just like grandma and grandpa with a backyard full of 100-year-old vines, and they, you know, help them farm them better, and they find a home for the fruit, and they pay them competitive prices for the fruit, and then they make the wines in this really thoughtful way. So we're going to talk about this a bit more, but this is the wine that's kind of representing prohibition. It's all going to make sense in a second. So you and I left our history lesson like in the 1880s, right? In the boom times when Napa's making a ton of wine. There's a lot of grapes in the ground. There's starting to be some decisions made in terms of what works where, but that is a short-lived kind of high. because reality is going to come crashing down in the 1890s. And so a couple of things happen. So phylloxera comes for the first time and wipes out a lot of the vineyards. And then, even though we knew how to solve for phylloxera, which in this case is grafting onto resistant rootstocks, very few people did it because it was also a massive economic recession in the 1890s, right? And also because it started to become increasingly clear that prohibition was going to happen. So, prohibition was voted into law at the end of 1919 and it went into effect in 1920. It lasted about 13, 14 years. The thing that I think we forget sometimes about prohibition is that it was a constitutional amendment, right? Like, we haven't done that many times. This was supposed to live forever, right? We were supposed to be a dry nation. And pretty much the opposite happened. Like from what I have read about prohibition, like it was a particularly wet time in American history. Like there was not a lot of, I would say, sobriety happening. In fact, if I close my eyes and think of the 1920s, I'm thinking of like
Yeah.
flappers and speakeasies, right?
For
And
Gatsby.
exactly. And those people were not sober. So prohibition was a failed experiment. But nonetheless, it had these huge impacts on the wine industry for a number of reasons. First of all, almost every winery in the country closed. There were a couple of loopholes that you could stay open, but pretty much that was it. But interestingly, area under vine in California actually grew during this time. And that's because there was this kind of strange little loophole in the language of the amendment that said, though it was illegal to make and sell alcohol, the head of every household in America could produce 200 gallons of non-intoxicating fruit juice a year, right? So what this amounted to was kind of a wink and a nod to allow home winemaking, which is what happened. And the home winemaking industry became huge. Now, this was a home thing, right? Meanwhile, in the public or sort of public adjacent spaces that used to be bars, nobody was drinking wine anymore because, it was hard to make and smuggle wine. It's perishable, it requires a lot of gear, you need a lot of vineyards, but booze like vodka, that's really sturdy stuff, right? So you can make it on the sly, you can smuggle it in really easy. So we saw the rise of classic cocktail culture happen in the 1920s, but there was also this rise of home winemaking. So this is a really amazing slide. So
Look at that.
yeah, so basically what happened during this time, in order to make wine, right, yourself, which imagine how great that must have tasted, you had these rail cars, these unrefrigerated rail cars, fill up with grapes at the hottest time of year, right?
Yeah.
And then they would have to make oftentimes a cross country journey into these city centers like New York, Boston, Atlanta, wherever, where people would come and bargain and buy them off the train.
Yeah.
Or you could buy kind of grape like products, right? So imagine, what would happen to these grapes, how unpleasant this journey was. This is a non-refrigerated, in this instance, open air bar. So a lot of this fine wine material would just turn to mush, by the time it got to its destination. But over time, they realized that there were a handful of grapes that became known as the shipper varieties that included Zinfandel and Petit Syrah that were sturdy enough or thick-skinned enough or tannic enough or dark-fleshed enough to make this journey and make great wine. So during Prohibition, even though wineries were closed, area under vine grew, and almost all of the vineyard land in California was replanted or grafted to Zinfandel, Petit Syrah, or a handful of other grape varieties. This is the reason why anytime you might see an old vine that looks like that, very good money that it's Zinfandel or Petit Syrah, right? Because everything else would have been removed.
Yeah.
Just because it's fun.
Yeah.
We'll go back to this is great. So look at this one on your right, like 2 carloads of grapes just received for grape juice jelly and other purposes.
Yeah.
Right. Michigan Concord grapes, which is hybrid variety, and then California Zinfandel. And then this one is really fun. So other than fresh grapes, you could also buy grape products like a jug of syrup. And this is a brick of dried grape skins. And it says instructions after dissolving the brick in a gallon of water, do not place the liquid in a jug away in the cupboard for 20 days because then it would turn into wine, right? Which is also a recipe, right?
Yeah.
So very, very cheeky stuff. So the wine industry didn't die. It just completely changed during Prohibition. And the good side of that is it left us with all this wonderful old wines and so this winery in particular, they are acting kind of like historians or archivists, right? They're finding these old vine vineyards. They're giving the owners a reason to keep the grapes in the ground instead of bulldozing them and replanting to something a little bit more fashionable. What do you think of the wine?
Mm. It's a little softer Zinfandel.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's nice finish.
It's a little more elegant, right?
Yeah.
Zinfandel can be very jammy, very intense, very dark. This is made with a little bit of a lighter touch, so it's fresher, brighter, it's more energy.
Yeah, it's tasty.
I'm glad you like it. It's one of my favorites. So wonderful. Any questions on any of that before we move on to Cabernet Land?
When I saw the word Concord grape, it reminded me of Welch's grape juice because, Concord grape, I believe, is on their label.
Yes.
So.
Yes. Another wine region that I love is the Finger Lakes in upstate New York. And Concord, Welch's, Manischewitz. That's a huge industry up there. And the fine wine zone is way more niche, but very promising.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, so these, like I said, these two Cabernets are meant to be tasted together and to be, more or less kind of considered at the same time. So this next slide, we're going to talk about all the history that kind of leads into modern Napa Valley, right? And then we're going to talk about these two wines. So in a sense, when I moved here in 2010 from New York and thought Napa started in the 1960s with Robert Mondavi, I wasn't necessarily wrong, right? This area really came back to life during that time. And what was really interesting to me when I first moved here and started to read more about the history of this place was that, Prohibition was repealed in 1933. The opening of the Robert Mondavi Winery in 1966 is celebrated as, that kind of date of the rebirth of Napa, right? The moment it came back alive. It was the first newly constructed winery in Napa since Prohibition. Why did it take 33 years for that to happen? And that is really fascinating, and I'm still kind of wrapping my mind around it. But basically, there were a big collection of simultaneous cultural changes. It would just take a long time to make their way back to wine in this country, right? So obviously, a big one was that cocktails became the thing that everybody drank during the 1920s and 30s, right? So wine lost a lot of market share, right? Secondly, the wine people were drinking during that era was probably not the best, right? Like your uncle's bathtub basement wine, it's not a great incentive to go and learn more. But also you had things like Prohibition was flagged, by the two world wars, right? World War I, World War II, these were on either sides of Prohibition. And during that time, you had two things happen. You had all of this technical innovation in the sort of food and feeding the troops zone that resulted in things like canned food, fast food, frozen food, soda pop, like all this sweet stuff, casual processed food. This is the kind of birth of that. And then you also have women leaving the home to join the workforce, right? And that also changed the way we ate. Right?
TV dinners.
Exactly, TV dinners. It just culturally, we weren't spending as much time around the table anymore, and we weren't doing it in the same way. And then in the wine industry here and in other places, some people did try to just, turn on the lights and get things going again. But we encountered a lot of problems with spoilage and hygiene in these wineries that had been effectively abandoned for so long. So a couple of things happened that would change the situation to open kind of American hearts and minds to find wine again, right? One of them was the fact that in the 1960s, jet travel became affordable to middle-class Americans for the first time. So you could take a 6 or 8 hour flight to Europe instead of a 2-month crossing, right? So that certainly streamlined things. You might come back exposed to great wines, excited about wine as part of the meal, such and such. You also had people like Andrei Chilachev in the top right, and then Robert Mondavi under him, who were sort of back of house and front of house of the wine revolution here. Andrei Chilachev really worked hard to elevate hygiene standards and winemaking protocols, notions of terroir, things like that. Robert Mondavi, meanwhile, was just a master marketer and promoter and really brought a lot of American wine out into the world, and then also brought a lot of the culture of fine wine drinking and the associated things. You talked about this in your episode with Carissa Mondavi, right?
Yeah.
Art and music and chefs and all that, brought that to Napa, right? Sort of said these belong together.
Yeah.
So that was important too, but also, we also had the fact that Prohibition was repealed in the middle of the Great Depression, right? And wine has always been kind of a cash-intensive operation, still true. So in the 1960s, these other things start coalescing, but the big one was, believe it or not, the hippie movement. And, this was really interesting for me to discover, because when I thought about hippies, I would think about, the Vietnam War, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and this kind of thing. But another big part of it was the Back to the Land movement, or the Back to Earth movement. And this was this huge zeitgeist of the times, where these professionals and students and young people were quitting their jobs, they were dropping out of school, and they were leaving the cities, and they were moving into the countryside to work with their hands. And this is, I know it sounds kind of crazy, but this is the direct way in which many of Napa's pioneering wineries in the 1960s got started, were these kind of like hippies that came west and wanted to work with their hands. And because of everything we talked about in the beginning of the class, right? The really specific and intriguing climate, the complex geology, the terrain of Napa, they just were able to make really great wine. And that wine attracted other people who were interested in wine, and that sort of started the ball rolling. So in the 1960s, you see a couple of big wineries like Mondavi get started, but also smaller operations like Heights and things like that kind of come into play. In the 1970s, there's even more momentum, right? More of this, people coming. And then you had a couple of really important moments in the 1970s, specifically the Judgment of Paris in 1976, which for you, I'm sure know all about it, but some of my guests haven't heard of it, but it was this blind tasting in Paris between American and specifically Californian and French wines with French judges, and the French judges anointed 2 American winners, right? That was a huge deal for Napa Valley. And then a couple years later, in 1978 and 1979, you had the establishment of the Wine Spectator and Robert Parker's Wine Advocate. And that was huge. That was basically the birth of American wine media. And this was so significant because prior to that, as an American, if you wanted to read about wine in English, you probably had to read what the British were saying, and they had all of Europe, at their feet. We were very far away and still really emerging. Wine media took American wine very seriously. And importantly, it also introduced the 100-point scale, which some people, love to hate, some people hate to love, but a lot of people use these scores to inform their buying decisions. It was so liberating and so democratic. It really kind of helped a nation that had forgotten everything they'd ever learned about wine get back excited about wine again, right? So the 100-point scale is meant to sort of mimic our school grades, right? With A kind of being 90 to 100, B, et cetera, and then there's a big old F, 50 points of F, 60 points of F. And it's meant to, so it's just really intuitive and easy to understand, and it helped an entire generation get excited about wine again. So then we get into the 1980s. Now we have finally caught up to Napa's success in the 1880s. You had even more wineries open, now more hotels, more restaurants, more tourism. All of this the ball is really getting rolling. And you also had, this was the time though where you had the French paradox and that cultural shift towards red wine. And then when you enter into the 90s, this is when the modern blueprint of Napa Valley is set. So from then on, business has changed. Napa being really tiny, the more it got kind of carved up among a bunch of interested parties and different brands, the smaller operations became. So today, Napa is a very niche environment. A lot of the wineries are incredibly small, which means they have to be selective with the markets they service. So there's a lot of wines you can get in Napa Valley that you can't maybe get where you're from. Today, Napa's incredibly successful. We have over 4 million visitors a year. Some of the most famous, top-scoring wines in the world. This isn't to, say that we've beaten anybody or we're on the top of anything, but my point is, I guess, you can't argue today with Napa's success. It's an incredibly successful, exciting place, and the wines are marvelous. It's much more established, right, than it used to be, and you feel that when you walk around. Like, the hospitality here is unparalleled. There's a lot going on. So it's estimated that there's over 500 physical wineries in Napa, but there's probably closer to 1,000 different brands, because not every brand is associated with a physical winery, right? So that's a lot. There's about over half of all the vineyard land is dedicated to Cabernet, and it's a massive economic engine for both the state and the country. So very important place. So why don't you take a minute and try these wines, and then talk to me about how different they taste or how similar, if you have a preference, these sort of things.
It's fun experiment.
Good.
You can say the wine on the right has a lot more body and tertiary flavors, and it has a longer finish.
Okay.
The mascot's a little bit more fresh, red fruit flavors.
They're very different, right?
But they're very different, yes.
So why I like to show these two wines, other than the fact that these are two of my favorites, the Mascot is a young vine wine from the Harlan properties, so what we call the domain. So Harlan Estate, the various vineyards of Bond, and Promontory. So some of the top vineyards in Napa Valley, but from the younger vines. So a little bit fruitier, more precocious, easy drinking, but still really incredibly well-made, complex wine. But it's a Napa Valley blend, right? And back in the day, in the 1970s and the 80s, the reserve wines, any winery, they would label their best wine as a reserve, and it was usually a blend of all these different sites in Napa Valley. And you would get these different characteristics that you would harmonize in the glass. So one site would produce the backbone, another site would produce maybe more flesh, another one a brighter, more vibrant acidity, and you would blend that together. So one of the things that I love about this wine is it's like a picture of Napa Valley, right? Juxtapose that with the Tony, which is both strictly a mountain wine, so a high elevation site, a single vineyard wine, so a single origin wine, and also just made in a more, I would say, specific way. So the Tony wine, this is a winery that's been around since the early 80s. It's still in family hands. It's now a father-daughter duo, which is, I just think is so wholesome and lovely. They make their wine, they pick earlier than I would say Napa average, and the wines tend to be a little lower in alcohol and have a more austerity of finish. So that long finish you talked about, it's pretty tannic, right? Like, it's got incredible grip. That is part of what allows this wine to age so well. And this winery is known for producing wines that age for a very, very, very long time. So they're both different stylistically. They're different in terms of like their goal. This is a young vine wine that's meant to be an introduction to, a very lofty portfolio. This is meant to be a wine that you cellar for decades probably, right? Single origin, high elevation site. And hopefully unlocks in the person in front of me an interest in saying, oh, well, what else can Napa Cabernet do? Show me more. And we have classes that are just this, that are just, 5, 6 different Cabernets from east, west, north, south, high elevation, low elevation, slopes, flatland, et cetera. And it's so fun to dig into the differences. So that's pretty much that. What do you think?
They're all fabulous, and I love them all for different reasons.
Good.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, yeah, this is just one of our classes. Hopefully, the goal always is to create a long-term relationship with the person we're sitting down with, so that the next time they come, we have our notes, we can refer to them and say, okay, this time, here's what I'm showing you. You know, we're going to build on that, or what do you want to learn next? And so, you know, I've been here 6 years now, so I'm getting to enjoy now those seeds we planted years ago with guests that come back and want to go a little bit deeper next time, and it's just the best. Yeah.
Thank you for walking me through that timeline.
Oh, thank you.
I learned so much.
Oh, good.
And I'm just curious to know from your perspective, what does the future of Napa Valley look like to you?
Like I said, I've been here for 15 years now, and one of the blessings of my early days in Napa was we talked about how Napa got kind of back on its feet in the 60s and 70s, right? So let's assume that those people were in their 20s and 30s, which meant that when I moved here they were in like round about their 80s. I was able to meet and spend time with some of the pioneers of Napa that had witnessed this massive change, right? And unfortunately, it's sad, but it's a part of life that we've lost, you know, a lot of them over the years. But what's taken their place is a new generation of, I would say, really engaged next generation vintners, and or sometimes someone else entirely. It doesn't always pass down to the children, right? But this confluence of new energy and new ideas, and also just this desire to honor all the work that came before, to keep improving, to keep iterating. This is sort of an era of refinement for Napa Valley. Like the big experiments are done, right? We don't need to plant golden shaslas everywhere anymore. Now we're refining on how do we do what we do best of all? How do we make it better? And so I think that is really exciting to see the next generation get more involved.
And not only are you an expert on Napa Valley, but other regions around the globe. So from your perspective, what does the future of wine look like?
Oh gosh.
I'm sorry, I'm getting a little brainy here, but I love picking your brain.
Drinking habits are changing. There was maybe some overproduction as a result of some over-enthusiasm in the COVID sales results, you know, when everybody was drinking wine. And a lot of other challenges, climate change that the region is facing, and not just this region, but everywhere. So I feel like I see a lot of negativity in the media, and also sometimes, you know, within the wine community. But I think that these are exactly the moments where like the next generation of heroes are kind of made, right? There's so much opportunity, I think, to think a little differently and to reimagine the way we do wine, so to speak. Like, wine is this multi-millennial, fabulous, important, like cultural, significant historical beverage, right? With relations to religion and mythology and art and all those things. It's tied to the humanities, but it is, you know, has a lot of competition today, right? And if people are too busy drinking other things to pay attention or be awakened to all that, then what does it really mean? And so I think the wine industry in general has a time, it's like a moment of rebirth, right?
That's very true.
And if you're even like a little bit mystical, like death and birth are really aligned. So I think anytime there are these huge challenges, this is also the moment for huge innovation, big ideas, you know, radical thinking. And so I already see some of that happening, and so there are some people and some things going on in the wine industry right now that I find incredibly exciting and fill me with hope. So I feel really good about things. Doesn't mean it's always going to be easy, and I think there's definitely some pains right now in the industry, but there's a lot of really wonderful stuff happening.
I think, yeah, it's almost like when vines struggle, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot more character to them. So that's
Exactly. Exactly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me pick your brain.
Not at all.
But wonderful.
Thank you.
Wines. Yes, thank you for sharing these. So my favorite question, if you could share a bottle of wine with anyone dead or alive, who would it be?
Okay, so I'm gonna choose someone dead just so that no one who's alive will be mad at me because because the dead don't get mad at people. I don't think. This might be slightly pretentious sounding, but I think it would be really amazing to meet and drink wine with Eleanor of Aquitaine. She's one of my kind of favorite historical figures. I know there's a lot of overwrought mythology about her, but even if just half of what they say about her is true, she just lived the most extraordinary life, right? She was, as far as I know, the only woman to be queen of two different countries.
Yeah.
So she was queen of France and then got a divorce when that was not a thing and immediately married the man who would become the king of England. She's effectively the reason why Bordeaux came to the English court. And like the relationship between Bordeaux and London is still alive and well, right? Hundreds and hundreds of years later. You know, she, I think, like, waged a coup against one of her husbands and he imprisoned her, and two of her sons were kings. She had 10 children. I mean, she was just this kind of bold, amazing, larger-than-life character who, you know, was from Margaux and has this connection to wine. I would like to meet her. She inspired, you know, Shakespeare, and just, she's amazing. And I guess either probably her or George Carlin. Those would be my two. Yeah.
So, cheers.
Cheers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kelly. So, Kelly, tell me about the various classes here at the Wine Center at Meadowood.
Sure. So we really offer a range of classes from beginning wine tasting 101, you know, understanding Napa Valley, things like that, to stuff that's a little bit more advanced, like blind tasting. Or we have a class that I love called What is a Grand Cru? And it's this idea of, we look at top designated wines in Bordeaux, where it's called a first growth, right? In Burgundy, where it's a Grand Cru. In Germany, where it might be a Grosses Gewachs, maybe a Cru Barolo, things like that. And then, of course, a really fine Napa Cabernet, and talk about, you know, what does this concept mean, right? It's a little geekier. We also invoke the humanities as much as possible. So sometimes we do a class called Wine and Art, where it talks about sort of the wine label and the relationship between artists and wine over time and what that conveys in a sort of meaningful. We are working on a class right now called Wine, Myth, and Religion that is still being shaped, but is going to look at wine's kind of role in mythologies around the world and rituals as well. And we also talk a lot about farming. So I moved here from New York City, which is about the opposite of farming community, as you can imagine. And being here in an agricultural place was incredible. And I think that, you know, people today are much more conscious of where things come from and how their food is grown, and you know, and so to remind people that wine is grown, right, and that is a kind of a differentiator from maybe a cocktail in a sense, like it has an origin, and what does that mean? So I have a class called Tasting Farming that I love, where we talk about.
So interesting.
Yeah, it's really fun, and it's a little niche, but we make it fun, and we look at organic wine, biodynamic wine, regenerative farming, dry farming, and we taste some great wines from those categories and just sort of talk about what they mean, what they bring to the glass. It's just a way to connect back to the earth, and sometimes we can do a vineyard walk. So yeah.
Great.
That's wonderful. Yeah, we have a demonstration vineyard that we designed and planted about 6 years ago, and it's just kind of in full bloom now, as it were. And we can walk that vineyard and talk about different grape varieties and clones and trellising techniques and row direction and how the vine grows and the different parts of the plant and soil. So for people that want to get their hands dirty and get some fresh air, we do that too. And we just try to offer a little something for everybody.
With your students in your various classes, are there certain aha moments that you found that have been quite fascinating, just to know what people have discovered through wine?
Honestly, my favorite thing about teaching are those aha moments, right? Where you really feel like you helped somebody unlock something in their understanding, or you got them really excited about something, and it can happen in unexpected ways, right? This is part of the benefit of all our classes being private, and that they're not a big group, although we do some of those too, but most of them are private, so people feel really comfortable, hopefully, asking intimate questions that they might be embarrassed about. And I remember, or when I was just starting, I had a couple in front of me that knew a lot about wine. I mean, they were very comfortable with fine wine. They'd been around it a long time. But as they got to know me and feel comfortable with me, at some point one of them said, I actually really am not totally sure how to hold a wine glass.
Oh.
And, they just had never felt comfortable asking that before, and because they should already know that, right? They had a lot of knowledge. And so we talked about why you hold it at the stem, when it's okay to hold it other places. And you could see this relief, and it was really cool.
It was interesting. I was talking with a winemaker the other day, and they said, I meet a lot of people on a daily basis, but there's certain characteristics around people that I don't forget. And it's similar to certain wines and those characteristics. So I thought that was a very interesting parallel.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. For me, anybody taking a wine class, right? Or that is traveling for wine, which a lot of the people that come to Meadowood are. They're here because they're passionate about wine, they want to learn more. My feeling is that they've already bought into this idea that great wine can elicit an emotional reaction. So we don't need to then say like, okay, we accept that, but we can only talk about it in these clinical terms, right? I think it's okay to be a little bit more sort of evocative and talk about the sort of the lightning that is like this Riesling, versus the sunset that is this Chardonnay. I think that is maybe even more universally understandable than talking about like lemon rind and hibiscus.
Yes.
So, not that that's there, but there's no hibiscus.
Yes.
But anyhow, so we try to, like I said, every experience that we do, even if you're picking a class off a sheet that's already been written, is customized because it's intimate.
I think wine is a lifelong journey. I've been studying wine for 10 years now, but I have so much more to learn.
Right.
And also from every person I meet, I learn something new about wine and their perspective on wine. So that's why I love meeting with bright minds like you.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, I learned so much, not only about Napa Valley, but so many other things.
Well, that's so important because I think this also sets people's mind at ease, because I think some people, maybe you've met people like this, where they're insecure about their wine knowledge because they think you have to sort of get to a certain point and before you can really speak about it with confidence. But what I like to tell people is that there's not one person on the planet that knows everything about wine. You might meet a lawyer that knows everything about tort law, right? Because like that has happened in the past, it's precedent. But wine is evolving, shifting, it's new every year. I mean, it's renews twice a year if you consider the two hemispheres, right? It is a very fluid situation, literally and figuratively. So once people understand that key is to just sort of stay curious, it's not about achieving a certain level of knowledge, it's just about kind of being open to going with the flow and staying engaged and staying enthusiastic. I feel like you can see the shoulders drop and some of the anxiety go away. It's a lifelong pursuit. It's a knowledge and an enrichment that you carry with you, not necessarily like a mountain that you get to the top of.
A great way of looking at it. And I think it's also important to remember that it's all about what you like too, right? Because it's across the board. There isn't like the perfect wine. It's the perfect wine to that person, and making sure that you're providing a recommendation to what their liking is and making them feel comfortable that that's the right choice.
Exactly. And I think people having a grasp of their own palate and getting a sense of that confidence is more important than, book smarts with wine. So everybody's going to come at this in an own specific way, and it's about paying attention to the person in front of you and sort of figuring out or intuiting or even just asking, what do you hear? Why are you here? What do you want to learn? Like, if you just want to relax and drink some great wines, we can do that. We do that too, If you want to, and if you're just interested in learning more, we can, dazzle you and show you all sorts of fun things. I mean, people have all sorts of different reasons for wanting to learn about wine, and once you kind of figure those out, you can really take them where they want to go, and you get way more aha moments, and it's just the best.
Amazing.
Thank
Love
you.
that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers.